Here we go.
That's it, we're live?
You should be live.
All right.
And
Everyone,
recording.
welcome to Graves Library in the Pasco lecture series. About 15 seconds ago, Mary Lou told me I was going to do all the introductions. So thanks for joining us online. There's about 150 people here in the room with us who we're not going to be able to take questions virtually. So please, all of you, start thinking immediately what you are dying to hear from our guest of honor, Bob Keyes. Let's give the virtual crowd a that's what 150 people clapping sounds like. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little. I don't know if I should look out or at the screen. I'm gonna look at you, Bob.
Okay. Conversation.
I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit, so I'm not going to go through the Wikipedia page of introducing Bob Keyes, who we all know. And I think the word that I keep thinking of as Bob has been doing these events for the past month is beloved. I think we can use that now. It's kind of stunning. You know, we've been thinking about our lives right now a lot, sort of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. I was thinking today about the main art scene pre-Bob and post-Bob, and I kind of can't remember before 2002. What did we do? What was being reported on the main arts? I honestly can't remember it, but I can't remember 2019 either. So, so we all know that Bob Keyes is the much loved, much revered arts reporter for the Portland Press Herald, Maine Sunday Telegram, has been with us here since 2002, winner of the Rapkin Writers Award for Journalism, and also the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, amongst many others. I am former Graves Library board member Josh Bodwell, longtime patron, late 70s, early 80s, I think was when I got my first library card here. And by a strange turn of events, I also get to now be Bob's book editor, which is a huge delight. So this is the only event so far that Bob and I have done together, and only the third time we have seen each other in person since he signed his book contract, which is amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah. The first time was when we got to bring Bob one of the advanced copies of the hardcover from the printer, which was a nice way to see each other again for the first time since the pandemic. But the entire book happened online, and as Tammy and Vicky will attest to, on the phone. Yeah. I think we spent maybe 100 hours on the phone during the pandemic, which was, gosh, always a lot to unpack.
Yes, we talked about quick conversations, and they were all at least 20, 30 minutes.
The short ones, yeah, the short ones, and then hours and hours. So we're here to talk about Bob's debut book, The Isolation Artist: Scandal, Deception, and the Last Days of Robert Indiana. It's a whole story, even how we arrived at that. So as Bob and I are talking, think about questions not only about the story of Indiana, but also if you have any interests about the actual process of the book going from idea to hardcover, because I think we're both willing to sort of pull the curtain back and talk about that process. So I told Bob a second ago, I'm going to save him by front loading the conversation with a little bit of the timeline, which is somewhat complex enough that we even in the back of the book put a timeline of Robert Indiana's life and all the key events. So we're going to give us a sort of a foundation to talk about by telling you the story of Robert Clark. So Robert Clark was born in 1928, born to a single mother, no father ever in the picture, and was adopted as an infant in the hospital. So this is the sort of Dickensian setup of this man's life, right? Never knew his birth parents, was adopted by the Clarks. 10 years later, the Clarks then divorce. Robert Indiana, still Robert Clark, because of his divorced adoptive parents, lives in 21 homes by the time he turns 17. So this is, 1928 till the late 30s. So difficult time in America. 1949 goes to the Art Institute of Chicago on the GI Bill. He spent a few years in the Army Corps. During that time, he makes his first trip to Maine to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Proper name? Yep. Then in early 50s, 1954, arrives in New York City. A couple years later, reinvents himself as Robert Indiana. Is from that time on, he embraced that persona enough, and things are changing quickly for him. By the 60s, he's in the New York World Fair with Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein, Rauschenberg, others. You know, it's a really important moment in American art, mid-century. Things are really taking off. 1965 is the first time that what we come to know as the love sculpture debuts as a greeting card from the MoMA. He was asked to do a Christmas card for them on commission. Years later, early 70s, US postage stamp of love comes out. It becomes, you know, ubiquitous. 1976, the love sculpture as part of a bicentennial celebration is put in what's now called Love Park in Philadelphia, the John F. Kennedy Plaza. So this incredibly, you know, fast art for him as an artist, really from that time of going into the Art Institute in 1949 to early 1970s, he's pretty internationally known by this point. By 1978, he's had it with New York and decamps to Final Haven, Maine, which is really the focus of Bob's book. This biography is in there and it's tightly and succinctly handled, but this story is really about Robert Indiana in Maine. And as I said to Bob in early 2019, he was the only person really that could tell that story, because soon after arriving in Maine and working at the soon after arriving in Maine and working at the Press Herald, Bob went out to interview Robert Indiana. So maybe we could start by you talking a bit about your first experience out there in 2002.
Sure. Yeah, summer of 2002. It was August, and I had met Indiana on the phone earlier that summer, a quick phone call to talk about an exhibition that he had, a group exhibition, and we hit it off well enough. He invited me out to Final Haven, and I went out with a photographer to spend the day in August of 2002. And the purpose of the visit was he wanted to show me some new work that he had made in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. And he had made at least one painting called Afghanistan, and it was in support of the invasion. More directly, it was in condemnation of Afghanistan. And he wanted to talk about that. And so I went out there and I spent the day with him. And he met John Ewing, the photographer, and I at the ferry terminal. We got in his car and we drove relatively quietly to the Star of Hope and to his studio, which was Kitty Corner, the sail loft. And once we got into the sail loft and we started talking about his art, Indiana opened up. And I've described him many times as gregarious and full of life and playful. And that's the way he was when I met him. He was clearly there to entertain us, and he was well prepared to do that. And he did that by talking about his life in the context of his art and by showing us around. And we spent most of the day, we spent most of the day with him, either in his studio or in the Star of Hope, which was his home on the island. And we had lunch with him, and then he took us back to the ferry at the end of the day. But it was a full presentation of Indiana in terms of his persona. He was dressed for the occasion in the sense that he looked remarkable. He had his hair pulled back. I believe there was a bandana, and he always had a cigar, so it seemed, but he definitely had a cigar going when he picked us up. And I don't know if that was for effect or if that's just the way it was, but it certainly made an impression on me right away. And that's what I carried forward during that interview, but also going forward.
So you mentioned Star of Hope now. Star of Hope is so important in this book that in the back, in the cast of characters, this building, the Star of Hope, is listed as one of the characters. So talk a bit more about the Star of Hope so everyone understands, especially in context to those childhood moves of 21 times before 17, what the Star of Hope was and what it meant to him.
Yeah, well, Star of Hope represented stability and a home that he could control. As Josh said in that introduction, which was really nice, Indiana moved around and he had no stability, and he had no opportunity to build a life for himself until he took control of his life. And he could do that with his art and with his life to some degree in New York. But in New York, many things are unstable, and he lost studios. He lost several studios, but two that were very important to him that he had begun to make into his home in terms of totally inhabiting the space. It wasn't just a place where he could make work or a place where he could live, but it was a place where he could do both and really take it to a third dimension in terms of his ability to fill the space with his personality. And he moved once and then he had to move again. And that frustrated him because he had such an unstable life. He possessed things. He liked to keep everything. He liked to keep examples of all of his work. He gladly sold his work, but he always kept at least one in a series. And he kept his clothes, and he kept his stencils, and he kept all of his art making tools. And that became a pattern in his life. And he needed a place for it. And Vinyl Haven and the Star of Hope presented that. It's a large building, formerly two buildings built in the late 1800s. Combined into one in the late 1800s, and became the lodge for the Oddfellows Lodge on Vinyl Haven. And a 3-story building with a dozen or so big rooms, a third floor, complete open space for gatherings for their meetings and whatnot, and full of memorabilia. When Indiana, it had been dilapidated and somewhat vacant for a while. When Indiana took it over, it was still filled with a lot of the Star of Hope memorabilia, coffee mugs, fez hats that they used in their ceremonies, some pieces of furniture. And Indiana not only filled it with his art, but he honored the tradition of the Oddfellows by trying to not just bring all those things out, but honor all those pieces of all those artifacts and memorabilia. And the Star of Hope became just as big a part of his life as his art, as the art itself. And interestingly, he had already at that point used the motif of stars in his artwork. That had been a recurring motif. In fact, love began as 4-star love. It was a series of stars. And so he believed in serendipity in all aspects of his life. And when the chance to finally have a home that represented in his mind a lot of his work already, and it gave him the opportunity to fully express himself, right away he saw it as a place that he could stay forever and create a museum to himself, essentially. And that's what he did. He spent 40 years essentially doing that.
Crucial point. So half of his life was here in Maine,
Yes.
those last 40 years. Around the time you said serendipity, had he done his Brooklyn Bridge prints before Maine, or did he do? No, either of those in Maine.
Yeah, yes, he did a Brooklyn Bridge, a tribute to the Brooklyn Bridge in 1983, which I believe was the 100th anniversary of the bridge.
Okay.
He was asked to do it. And so Indiana lived in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York and Quinte Slip, and the Brooklyn Bridge was a powerful force in his life. It represented a lot of things for him, but among other things, it represented sort of the next phase for him. And I don't think he knew it at the time, but the Brooklyn Bridge, of course, was built with granite from Vinyl Haven. And so when he learned that, Vinyl Haven became the obvious place for him. He felt he was destined to be on Vinyl Haven for a variety of reasons. And the fact that the granite from the Brooklyn, or the foundations of the Brooklyn Bridge were built with granite from Vinyl Haven, was one fact that was very much confirming and affirming for him in terms of his decision.
So before we talk about Vinyl Haven, another important character in the book, when you say filled Star of Hope, explain the move from New York to Vinyl Haven.
Yeah, so it was difficult. As I said, Vinyl Haven, Indiana was a collector. He had a lot of artwork, and it took 2 vans, 13 trips back and forth. 2 vans, 13 trips back and forth between New York and the ferry terminal, and then from the ferry terminal over to the island, and then from the other end of the ferry terminal to the studio and to his home. And it was an ordeal for Indiana, and it was a spectacle for the community. Indiana at that point was a world famous artist, and people knew who he was. And he had no intention of living anonymously on the island. If he did, it was naive. There's no way he could have done it. And so his presence was announced right away, just by the fact that he showed up. And the move took a long time, and it was his announcement that he had arrived in Maine. And he announced when he got to Maine that he intended to stay, and that he wasn't going to be a summer resident, and that he was going to make his life here. And that's exactly what he did, which is a remarkable thing.
So if we think right now Kennebunkport is a small town, so 1978 Vinyl Haven would be, times 100 or times 1,000.
Yeah.
And here's Robert, Indiana with 26 vans filling the grandest building on Main Street, huge slate roof, gambrel roof, very elegant. So Robert, Indiana and Vinyl Haven became a constant conversation that we had, how he was accepted or not accepted, how he was perceived, is a very important part of this story.
Absolutely. And yes, integral part of the story. It's probably the most important part of the story. Very small community, a very, what's the word, lightning rod of a figure, as an artist and as a personality. And people had an opinion about him right away, as anybody would. And the opinions on Indiana were fairly mixed from the beginning, for a variety of reasons. He wanted to fit in, he wanted to be comfortable in the island, and he wanted to become part of the community. And he demonstrated that by fixing up the Star of Hope, which is a very important building in the community. It had historic connotations and had important significance architecturally on Main Street, and it had fallen into somewhat disrepair. And Indiana made an effort to give it some life again and to fix it up, not just with paint, but with other things. And he wanted to endear himself to the community. And that went reasonably well for a while, until just the force of his personality took over, and he started to divide people in the community through his actions and through just the nature of his life out there. Specifically, by 1992, he had become a polarizing figure, and he had faced charges of having sex with underage boys, and was charged, faced 3 counts, 2 of which were dismissed, 1 of which he went to trial for in 1993 and was acquitted. But he was not acquitted in the court of public opinion on the island by any stretch. And from that point on, especially, his life became very, very difficult out there. And I was surprised after he died, when I made my first visit to the island and talked to people who were not involved in his life, either through the art world or through his lawyers and whatnot. The first islanders that I spoke with spoke in such disparaging terms about him. It was a side of the story that I was aware of, but wasn't fully aware of how strong those feelings still persisted in the community. And one woman told me that until he died, she didn't feel safe with her kids in the community, which I found to be an extreme reaction, but it was exactly how she felt. And that provides a little bit of context with the sort of life that he lived from early 1990s until he died in 2018. And the feelings of animosity grew over time, even as the time from the acquittal moved away. A survey was done by the Star of Hope Foundation after Indiana died about what to do with the Star of Hope itself. And a solid third of the people who responded to the survey expressed disdain for him and a lack of desire to have any sort of honoring of him on the island. And so not the majority of people by any stretch, but a solid, significant piece of that population felt very strongly against him.
I think one of the most powerful lines in the book, paraphrase it, but is at the end of his life, or as he's passed, and you were talking with someone on the island who said essentially, if they found Robert Indiana bleeding in a ditch, they'd leave him.
Yes, they would have driven on past and let the elements take care of it.
A direct quote. I mean, I want to contextualize that a little bit too, though, that in 1978, when Robert Indiana and Bob, arrived at Vinyl Haven, he was an out gay man. He wasn't flamboyantly out, but he was living his life as a gay man. In 1978 Maine, that was not easy. And it was a time, I would say, that being a gay man was synonymous with being a pedophile.
Right.
And a lot of that is not fair. That said, he lived a complex life. So there's a lot of grayness to what was perhaps pushed on him unfairly and what he did and was perhaps accurate.
Yes.
And there's a lot of grayness about that still, even in the reporting that you could do.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I learned when I began this job in 2002 and interviewed him right away was that the art world, and I put that in air quotes, felt strongly that those charges were unfair, that he was set up for the reasons that Josh just said. He became somewhat of an easy target because of his lifestyle and his reputation. And so the art world felt that Indiana had been unfairly treated and was fairly acquitted. And they were pleased with that. And whenever the discussion came up about the sexual charges, from my perspective as a reporter, they were shot down right away because they were as just untruthful, and they didn't have a solid reputation at all. That was my understanding that I brought into my job from what people told me in 2002. And as time went on, I learned it's not that simple. It's a very complicated situation. And leave it there.
So that's the grayness that he existed on Vinyl Haven. Again, some of it pushed on him, some of it his own doing. Vinyl Haven, I'll give two anecdotes that we talked about during the reporting. Well, one of them is in the book actually, which is when the pandemic started, a lot of people with second homes were coming to Maine to sort of ride it out up here, especially if you were, somewhere in New York where the things were spiking. So a couple arrived on Vinyl Haven at their second home early in 2020. Some of the locals were not happy to have New Yorkers arriving on Vinyl Haven. So they went over one morning and cut a tree down at the end of their driveway, across their driveway, so they couldn't leave their house. So this is 2020 sort of vigilante island justice. There was just an acquittal of a killing of a lobsterman, sort of lobsterman on lobsterman crime.
Yes.
That was just 2020.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's not, during these conversations that Bob and I were having about the island, these aren't, reaching speculative things. There's still a degree of island life that is very real out there. These, multi-generational sort of tribal cultures.
Yeah.
We were joking that if Bob did an event on the island, we'd have an idling lobster boat so he could run down and jump in and make a getaway as the natives came with torches and pitchforks.
I didn't think that was a joke.
Oh, sorry. That's right.
But we haven't had the events.
We have to get that into the budget.
I want to say one thing about
Yeah,
that point in terms of Indiana and his perception in town. When I met him in 2002, we were approaching the first anniversary of 9/11, and Indiana had been in New York for 9/11, and that had obviously a big impact on his life. And when he returned to Vinyl Haven after 9/11, he had painted the shutters that he had used to cover the front windows of his home because they had been broken by vandals repeatedly. He painted them red, white, and blue, and he flew 6 large American flags from the top of the Star of Hope. And he made a point of telling me that he did that because he did it because he felt patriotic, but he also thought it would be the most significant gesture he could make to help endear him to the community. And that was in 2002. And he was still trying to figure out how to present himself in a way the community would find him hospitable.
And to reiterate, in 2002, by this time, the front windows on the Main Street level are boarded up because they're so regularly rocks are thrown through them. So why keep putting glass in? He just started putting plywood in.
Yep.
So let's, so 2002 is a crucial part in the book, obviously, your introduction to him, but then perhaps the most pivotal moment in the book is 2008. So he's still got 10 years left. But Bob was invited out to celebrate his birthday, his 80th birthday on the island in 2008. So, as your editor, I'm reading these scenes where I thought, how could anyone know this? Bob is literally the fly on the wall in the kitchen. You can picture out here on the lawn, all these guests from literally around the world are arriving to wish Robert Indiana a 50th birthday. And Bob is inside with Robert Indiana and these two men who are fighting over controlling his artwork.
Yep.
So will you pick that up a little bit and talk about the 80th birthday?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two men are Michael Mckenzie, who was one of his art dealers, and Simon Salamacaro, who is another art dealer who had a much longer history with Indiana. And Michael Mckenzie had sort of burst on the scene in 2008, returning to Indiana's life. He had been part of Indiana's life before, but came back into his life in a big way and had proposed to Indiana to create a new piece called Hope, which would be very much like love. 4 letters, 2 over 2 with the tilted O. And Indiana embraced that idea and they started this project together. And Mckenzie, who's I describe him as a car salesman in the book, or used car salesman in the book, and a carnival barker, which is, well, it's accurate, but
we edited it down to that.
Yeah, he's very loud and boisterous, and he succeeded in getting Hope, a sculpture of Hope, manufactured and placed out in Denver for the Democratic National Convention. And it became, not the sculpture itself, but the theme of Hope became a big motif in the Obama campaign. And it did so much for Robert Indiana's life and career. He was thrilled with the attention. He had another major successful piece. And it was because of Michael Mckenzie, who was very much a hustler, but it worked. And so Indiana started paying attention to Mckenzie. And Mckenzie began convincing Indiana that the Morgan Art Foundation, which Simon Salamacaro represented and had been doing business with Indiana for a full decade at that point, was not treating him well, and that Mckenzie would treat him better. And so this conflict began. And the morning of that party in 2008, Simon Salamacaro had been to Indiana's studio and had seen a whole array of Hope paintings that he interpreted as silk screen prints that Mckenzie had mass produced and brought to Indiana as original work. And Simon Salamacaro was concerned about that for obvious reasons. He had a contract with Indiana, and while he was probably okay with the idea of Indiana doing a sculpture with Mckenzie, the idea of doing a whole bunch of work with him was not something that was going to work. And so Simon Salamacaro was very upset. When I arrived at the party that morning, there was tension in the air between Simon Salamacaro, Michael Mckenzie, and Robert Indiana. Our interview had been prearranged. I arrived and we started talking, and Michael Mckenzie's talking about hope and everything that's going to happen with Indiana from here on out. And Simon is talking about what a great American artist this guy is, and really nothing is going to touch love, and good luck with Hope, but don't forget about the rest of his career. And meanwhile, Indiana is just sort of slinking out of the conversation. I didn't know what was going on at the time, but it became obvious a decade later when this lawsuit was filed that the conflict had begun that morning, and Indiana was acutely aware of the fact that these two men had serious conflict with each other, and he was absolutely caught in the middle of what was going to become literally a lawsuit that would end his life.
All right, you're jumping ahead to lawsuit.
All right.
I gotta put the editor hat on, rein you in.
Yeah.
He's jumping right.
You're not
I've got a timeline here. Maintain the timeline. I want to give a little context to those characters in his life. That Michael Mckenzie with Hope is just saying to Indiana, let me do this. It's going to be great. You're going to need $1 million a year, no matter what. So the onus is on Mckenzie to go out there and hustle and do it. So it's a guaranteed paycheck. And at that time, the Morgan Art Foundation is also selling millions of dollars of Indiana work, but it's using very interesting accounting tactics.
Yeah.
They've actually created an LLC at one point to act as a middleman. So this is just to give you an idea of the stakes around someone like a Robert Indiana. So Morgan Art Foundation will say they're going to, sell an Indiana piece for $3 million to a client. They sell it instead to this middleman. The middleman sells it to the client for $6 million, but they only pay Robert Indiana on the $3 million sale.
And they deduct the fees based on the $6 million sale.
So they're doing some tricky. Does accounting sound good to you, Ben? Voodoo economics, I think is the term.
And Indiana sort of had a sense this was going on, but didn't really pay enough attention to figure it out. And he told Simon, "I'm quote unquote, I'm not a businessman. Don't inundate me with all the invoices." But
so to all his imperfections that Bob was talking about, at the same time, these are the kind of people that are surrounding him. So you've got an artist with a healthy ego and loves money. He's happy for the wins, but he's also being surrounded by a really complex cast of characters with their own agendas, to say the least. So 2008, that's all percolating now. 2016 is the next big date. Yeah, not even gonna get the lawsuit yet. 2016 is the next big law. So Indiana is 2 years from dying now. And somewhat out of the blue, his long-term attorney is fired. And in comes this new regime. There's a new will, which is maybe not coercively signed. There's a new head of the estate and a new character who is sort of leading, head of the fortress, if you will. The Star of Hope has now become locked down like a fortress, and Indiana has become the isolation artist. People can't see him, can't get to him. Is it 2016 is your last interaction with him?
my last direct interaction was prior to that, but I had tried to get to 2016 and was rebuffed.
Yeah.
So it was my interaction with this camp, so to speak, but I didn't get through to him.
Okay. So that period of his life, suddenly he's shut off. He's still alive, but he's shut off, and this new regime has surrounded him. So that's how the last 2 years play out.
Yes,
is really with that group leading things again with their own agendas. So then spring of 2018, this lawsuit, finally, everything that had been percolating between these competing factions leads to this lawsuit where the Morgan Art Foundation sues Indiana and Mckenzie. And that becomes a big thrust of this story, is that legal wrangling. Tammy took a picture of Bob in his studio after the book, and Bob had a stack like this of legal documents that he's leaning on, of what had to be parsed through. So talk a little bit about the lawsuit, if you will.
sure. The Morgan Art Foundation filed a lawsuit on May 18th against Indiana, essentially to protect him from what they perceived as a lot of fraudulent artwork that was being made under his name and that was in violation of their contract with them. So it was basically a copyright infringement case. And Michael Mckenzie was named, and then Jamie Thomas, the caretaker, who had in 2016 assumed power of attorney and medical power of attorney over Indiana's life. Indiana stopped communicating with the outside world. He became isolated, and Morgan Art Foundation stopped being able to reach him. Like, all of a sudden, their client was inaccessible, and their emails were rebuffed. Eventually, they were
mildly.
Yeah. Eventually, they were told that Jamie Thomas had become the power of attorney, and everything was going to have to work through them. And so they put their case together. They spent a couple of years working on a lawsuit that they filed in May 2018, and we learn theoretically the next day Robert Indiana died. His date of death was May 19th, 2018, and none of this we knew until the following week, when the lawsuit became more public and we learned that Indiana had died, and then there was a series of sorting out everything that had happened. The lawsuit, just to quickly try to summarize, the lawsuit between Morgan Art and Indiana and the Indiana state has essentially been settled. The legal maneuvering between Morganart and Mckenzie continues, and the Indiana estate is still embroiled in some arbitration with Mckenzie. So the lawsuit continues. That stack of papers gets larger.
I think that's a good place to start to sort of unpack the book itself,
Yeah.
the writing of the book itself, because there's still to this day, remember in our early conversations, there was Bob and I had to quickly come to this realization and acceptance that this wasn't going to be a book that tied everything up with a neat bow. It's just impossible. There are a couple people that have a lot of the answers. One is dead, he's Robert Indiana, and one is talking to nobody, Jamie Thomas, who was that isolator at the end of his life. But I mean, this is the kind of narrative nonfiction book that was so closely tied to newspaper journalism that Bob was literally trying to piece together which day Indiana died and how to do that. So that meant trying to get information from the airport in Vinyl to find out when his body was literally flown off of the island, because those 24 to 48 hours were so important. And he arrived on the mainland, and the people around Indiana wanted to immediately cremate him. And because of the lawsuit and because of some other issues, the FBI stepped in. There was an agent that came up from Boston who had worked the Whitey Bulger case. Just the sort of level of, they arrived and say, no cremation, autopsy.
Yep.
So during the reporting of the book, Bob spent time talking with two forensic pathologists going through the autopsy report, which has a conclusion that is
Undetermined.
undetermined.
Which is exceptionally rare.
To
Both undetermined cause of death and manner of death.
what's the percentage? How many?
About less than 3%.
Less than 3% of autopsies have that, and that's to this day.
Yes.
Robert Indiana's adoptive family, the Clarks, raised him as a Christian Scientist. Actually, the love sculpture, he said, was influenced in part because at the church he grew up going to, there was one thing on the wall that said God is love, and he looked at that all the time in the word love. So as a Christian Scientist, had really pushed back against Western medicine, but that autopsy report shows
He was full of medicine, full of all kinds of end-of-life drugs, morphine among others, and he rejected all kinds of medical care throughout his life, with very few exceptions, and had made a determination that he wanted to spend his life, the end of his life, in his home. And a care team was assembled by Jamie Thomas, and they made end-of-life decisions on his behalf that involved a cocktail of drugs that are very common among people going through hospice care. None of what was administered was out of ordinary in terms of that routine end-of-life care, other than the fact that he was a Christian Scientist. And we don't know how he felt about that, but his friends were surprised to learn that he had gone through that retinue of drugs, given how he had lived his life and things that he had expressed. So there are some legitimate questions, but on the other hand, the nurse, who was very cooperative with me, spoke with me on a number of occasions, made it very, very clear that she had spoken with Indiana on a number of occasions leading up to the point where he became infirm and unable to care for himself, and that he had consented to some of this, or at least that he was aware of it. And so that is another one of those gray areas. But certainly his death was suspicious in the eyes of the FBI, and suspicious in the eyes of the pathologists from the state of Maine who did the autopsy, as well as other folks that we had look at it. Everybody agreed, the independent folks that we had look at the autopsy agreed that somebody wasn't convinced that his death was clean, and they needed to try to figure out what that meant. So
it was a fascinating, exciting moment in the editing process, I must say.
Yeah.
So to back up or to jump forward, I guess, to that, early in 2019, I sent Bob an email basically saying, I bet there are Robert Indiana stories you couldn't tell in the paper, and I bet you could fill a book with them. And he essentially said, I was hoping you'd call, which was a pretty great answer. But it had been on his mind. And then with some convincing, I hadn't realized, but apparently I was very convincing about it. So convincing, in fact, that we had everything rolling by March of 2020. And before Christmas of 2020, Bob turned in a first draft. That was how fast you wrote that, which was mind-boggling.
No, you had a deadline.
We did want to beat another book that might come eventually, but it is mind-boggling because then you completely rewrote it over the next 2 or 3 months, including going back to people like the nurse who handled his end-of-life care to re-interview, to go back and push deeper with many people. I mean, between first and second draft, you must have done another dozen interviews.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Either new interviews or interviews with new people or re-interviews. Yeah.
How is that for you? This is your debut book.
Yeah.
You know, you're used to writing on a newspaper deadline, which is much different than a book deadline.
Yeah.
How is that for you, sort of the editing and drafting process from what you've been used to for 40 years?
Well, it's very different, obviously. I get immediate feedback in my job at the newspaper, essentially because I turn in a story a day or 3 or 4 stories a week, and the editing takes a matter of hours, and then the stories in the paper. Josh and I agreed to talk maybe once a month just for check-ins, and I was just doing my work and started to write the book in June, and was really living essentially in terms of the book life in a bit of a vacuum. And when I turned the manuscript in mid-December, I knew that it needed work. I didn't know what that meant. And I'm used to having to do rewrites. It's just part of my job. And so I don't know if it was a couple of weeks, but when Josh came back to me with what I think you thought was a scary note, to me, it was just 15 or 18 things I needed to do, which didn't actually seem that bad. I mean, every one of them was, I can do that, no problem. And none of it felt daunting to me. And so I don't know if I have to go back and re-interview people for stories, but this process, the writing process was very different, very different. The reporting process was what I do all the time. And I don't know, it didn't.
How was the writing process different?
Well, the writing process was intense. I started writing the book in June, and in 5 days of writing, I had about 14,000 words written, which felt like a lot. And it was a lot. I mean, and I've never probably been that productive, but it came very easy, probably because I had all the material that I needed. And I was in a place where I did not have internet and could not go back and check things. All I could do was write, and that helped. The rewriting process in January was intense. That was a lot of early mornings that would continue through the day and into the night. And I've never done that before. And that was all new. And that was really fun. I actually enjoyed it a lot. It was stressful, but not, it's stressful in a different way. I don't feel like I've answered that question well, but the job, the process of writing is very different, but it's journalism. It's a story that I was writing for the paper on a continuing basis, which made it very easy for me to transition into the weekends, into the story of the book, because it was a familiar topic. It wasn't something I wasn't already dealing with. And that made it super easy. And the other thing that is essential is, as Josh noted, that we started this project in March 2020. I signed the contract on March 8th. The pandemic began the next week. I have not been into the office to work a shift since March 12th. Everything's been at home. I live in Berwick, so I save 2 hours a day of commuting. And that's 10 hours a week. And I dedicated basically a full shift a week to the book. And I treated it as just part of my job. And that made it very, very doable for me, because it was just something I could deal with. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. I mean, it's so fascinating that it is a pandemic book in a way, but it's not at all about the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we got lucky.
When
that
I
we were
had to
able-
work on this in the fall intensely, that was when we re-shut down. I was working upstairs. Vicky and Luke were downstairs doing their thing. Luke was going to school remotely. We were all in the house and we just buckled down and just did it.
I want to say about the stress too, because I mean, I was stressed too. We were both
Yeah.
stressed, but I think the stress for me was very interesting because we were constantly having conversations about getting it right, about the obligation of this book. You know, this is a narrative nonfiction book. The majority of the people in this book are alive and spoke on the record with Bob.
Yep.
And there's a very serious obligation to handle that carefully in a way that is not, you know, that the New York Post did a piece on this book. And it's like they went through and found every hyperbolic, salacious thing from each chapter. They made the whole story about that. You know, it was the New York Post as a Saturday Night Live skit. But Bob and I were constantly talking about how to make sure things weren't salacious or weren't hyperbolic and were so accurate. And that stress, I think, was really good.
Yeah, definitely. I will say this. This is not surprising, but it was interesting for me to hear this feedback from my newspaper editors as we got into this book deeply in the fall and into the winter. And as the court case was really moving along at a fairly quick pace, my editor commented to me how much more clear my stories were for the paper. And it's because I was living with this topic all the time. It's all I was thinking about. And it was interesting to me how clearer my writing became about just the court case, and just I could write a 20-inch story that actually had some new information. It wasn't all background, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And you could say it like as tight as a haiku.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to read the third paragraph here just as an example of how tight you could get once you sat down. This is the third paragraph of the book. And I remember specifically when you sent the first draft, I printed it out that night before I went to bed, and it was on my bedside table, and I read it in the morning in bed. And I read this paragraph and I knew we're onto something. The artist had a reputation for being reclusive, but he wasn't a recluse. Another word people like to use to describe him was hermit, but he wasn't that either. Robert Indiana was an ass. That's the third paragraph, and I said, all right, Bob is all in. This is gonna work. And people constantly bring that up to me. I don't know about you, but people bring that up to me as the editor all the time. Tell me about, I mean, I didn't know you were gonna write that.
Yeah.
You know, it just arrived and I thought, this is it. He's done it.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad to hear that. But the interesting thing, Josh had told me, I don't know exactly how you said it, but not to expect to hear from you right away. You were going to read the book, and I heard from you right away. I think it was that next morning. You said, "I'm glad." You commented on ass right away. It's like,
tell me about when you. I mean, that's an example of something you would never do in the paper.
oh yeah, I would never do that.
Right.
Yeah, couldn't do that. Although Trump has changed that. But so it's interesting. I had the original first chapter was going to be the 80th birthday, and that's the way it worked up until late in the writing process. And I wrote that not too much before I turned the book in, probably in October, November. And I don't know where that came to me, but I realized that Robert Indiana isolated himself, and what Josh just read sets up the routine that people have to go through to see him, in terms of knocking a certain number of times on his door or ringing a certain number of times on his phone to get him to answer. And as I thought about how he had, you know, become isolated, but had done that to himself through his routines, I realized that he kind of, I mean, he was an asshole. He didn't have to, no, I'm sorry, he was an ass.
I was just gonna edit it.
Sorry, he didn't have to do that. He made things difficult for people. He made things difficult for me as a journalist. He made things difficult for his art dealers. Everybody that he dealt with, he made things difficult for. And I needed to put that in context, because I had been conflicted as a writer over the course of my career writing about him. I wanted to like him. He was gregarious. He was full of life. He was a showman. But there was this other side of him. And the more I learned about him, and the more I talked to other people, and the more that I realized how difficult he could be, I knew I had to do that right away, and it needed to have some impact.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how or when I wrote it, but I knew as soon as I wrote it that was going to be what it was.
Well, it's true. You unpack it across the book. So for me, when I read it as an editor, I thought, you've alerted us to a couple things immediately, confidently, that this is an unreliable lead character that we're going to read about. But also, Bob and I had spent a lot of time before you even wrote anything, just talking about what Bob wanted the book to be or not to be. And one of those was that Bob didn't want to be the swashbuckling reporter driving around Maine saying, and then I did this and I did that.
Right.
You know, so that became a big part of it. But when I read that line, I thought, okay, everyone can trust this narrator. This man who tells us, who isn't going to be saying, I did this and I'm the brilliant reporter, but can tell the reader on page 1 something that succinctly and frankly about Indiana. I thought, you've got my trust.
I appreciate hearing that. Yeah, we did have a lot of conversations about no first person. This book is going to be reported journalistically and written that way, but written with personality. And that was the way to do that right from the beginning. Yeah.
And man, it worked.
Well, it was a lot of encouragement. It's not, as a newspaper writer, it's very hard to switch gears and write with a little bit of personality. And I will say, despite the fact that I've been in the business now for almost 40 years or whatever, having written this book, my writing for the paper has loosened up a lot. I've noticed that, which is very interesting. I have more confidence as a writer, and I'm willing to it's not a matter of interjecting opinion. It's just a matter of choosing how you phrase things that have more authority. And I would not have done that if I hadn't had this exercise.
That's
Which is
really
interesting.
Yeah.
I think every newspaper reporter should write with more personality, actually. That does not mean with opinion, but you want to know what the reporter's like when you read that story.
Right.
Yep.
That is a fact-based sentence.
Yes,
Robert
it is a
Indiana.
fact-based sentence.
Right.
Right.
That's what's
And I
so
had to
fascinating.
arrive at it as a fact. That's why I explained that.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, he made things difficult and he didn't need to.
Yeah.
And so much of what happened to him was because of who he was and how he was.
Right.
Yeah.
We should take some questions.
Yeah.
Seeing the clock over there. Oh,
So do you think he made things difficult in an attempt to control?
So that he could control his world around him. Yes, absolutely. And yet he lost total control of things. But I think that's exactly it. He wanted to control his life for the first time. And art gave him the ability to do that. And of course, the Star of Hope gave him the ability to do that. So yeah, he loved the idea that people knew he had money and he had power. And he liked the idea that people wanted to become associated with him because he could dole that out. Yep.
it's a little black and white, but you could say the first 40 years of his life were out of control.
Yes.
His childhood, the moves, even in New York, he's being pushed out of places, moved around, not getting the attention he thinks he deserves. So Vinyl Haven, Star of Hope represented under control.
Yeah. Yeah.
For all this research, talking, did you like the guy?
Yeah, I did like the guy. Yeah. I liked being in his presence. I found him to be entertaining and fun and sometimes funny. The things that I learned about him after he died have not diminished my memories of being with him, they're not vast, but they were enough that I have some feelings. But I understand him with a lot more layers and understand he was really complex. And, you know, eventually, I'll say this. I interviewed many, many curators and other people who had relationships with him, and without very few exceptions, and I'm trying to think if there are any, all those relationships ended difficultly. Everybody was sad with how their friendship with him ended. Some sort of conflict.
Dan O'Leary,
Yeah,
even, I don't.
yeah. He wouldn't tell me why though.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you know, it's such a dichotomy of wanting to control, and yet, so what would you attribute his lack of business savvy, if you would call it that he was not paying attention? Was that something in age? Was it decline? Or
No.
Did he always not really paid attention to who controlled his money and his image
Yeah,
and how that was able to happen?
he let's see, that's an interesting question. He definitely wanted to control how people thought about him and how people perceived him. But he early on gave up control over his business by choice. Susan Ryan, I describe her as his primary biographer in the book, told me a story in the mid to late 90s. He had opened up a drawer in his house that was full of mail that he had never opened. And Indiana, in addition to having issues related to the sex charges in the 1990s, also had a series of tax liens with the state revenue. He didn't pay his taxes. He didn't open his bills. He didn't pay his bills. He didn't pay attention to a lot of those details. And so he had the opportunity to have control, but he chose not to do it because I don't know if he couldn't be bothered or if he didn't have the mental capacity as an artist, didn't want it in his brain. But Susan Ryan was among those people who said that he would have benefited tremendously from having somebody to take care of those things for him, and not just in a business sense, but also just to help him as an advisor. Simon Saul-Macaro also has talked about how he became very frustrated dealing with Indiana early on in their relationship. Indiana didn't follow through with things, and he began to realize, Josh used the word unreliable, and that's what he was. He was unreliable in business, and he became a difficult guy to do business with, and they all became frustrated with him.
I'm interested in the process of writing that you did. I mean, did you give yourself a certain number of words to do a day, as a lot of writers do, or did you have an outline? How did you attack it?
I didn't give myself a daily word count because I mostly worked on weekends, but I set, our original goal was 30,000 words, and that seemed reasonable to me. And that was over basically 10 months. So in my mind, I was going to try to write about 3,000 words a month. And we ended up at about 55,000 words. So we doubled that, close to doubled that. And I just got into the routine of mostly writing on Saturdays or Sundays, but usually not both. And I had the intention of writing during the week, but I never did that. I pretty much concentrated on weekends. And so it became a 1 or 2 a day weekend routine unless I took vacation. And I used all of my vacation time. I get 4 weeks. I used all of my vacation time to work on the book in 2020. Yeah. Go ahead.
Was he producing art while in isolation? And if so, was it getting out? Was he releasing it?
Really interesting question. He was producing work that I think most people would agree was original and legitimate up through the early 2010s-ish. And then after that, he produced a lot of work that is very questionable. So one of the issues, one of the questions is how much he knew about what was going on. Before Indiana gave up power of attorney in 2016, there is a lot of murkiness. After 2016, you can see a lot of new work that went out that he may have known something about, but certainly had nothing to do with. And there are a number of pieces from 2016 to the end of his life, sculptures and works on paper and other things. Yep.
Like a giant sculpture for a sausage manufacturer in the Midwest that says brought, but it looks like love. Yeah. With it, what was the payout on that?
The commission was over $1 million, and he received about $230,000 for that, and that was his last check. So the story there was a Michael Mckenzie piece, and Michael Mckenzie got the commission, probably did the design, and had it manufactured and placed, and that became it continues to be a fight between the estate of Robert Indiana and Mckenzie over whether Indiana authorized that piece. Mackenzie's argument has been that whether he did or didn't is irrelevant because Jamie Thomas approved it, and Jamie Thomas had power of attorney, and Jamie Thomas did have power of attorney. And so that's being arbitrated I don't know, I think it's being arbitrated as we speak.
When you read the book, you'll see at the end that there are these incredible email chains between Michael Mckenzie and Jamie Thomas. Basically, while Indiana is on its deathbed, Well, they're just spitballing words like brought and love and hope about what they're gonna do.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
Who's in the Clark family? Who gets the money now?
Yeah, well, there is no Clark family. He had no heirs. There's a cousin that may still be alive, but he had lost contact with Indiana at some point in the early 2000s-ish. So the Star of Hope Foundation, which is a foundation that Indiana established in 2016. In fact, it was the last thing his previous lawyer had done before he had been fired, was set up to handle his estate upon his death. And that also is being, well, it's been settled at this point. The Star of Hope Foundation is up and running and is going to interpret the Star of Hope house as an educational center. And we'll see what happens to his artwork. And we'll see where the money and the artwork is divided between the Star of Hope Foundation and the Morgan Art Foundation, both of whom have legitimate rights. And it's just a matter of sorting out who owns what. The estate could be worth as much as $100 million. There's a lot at stake, but it's not, there's very little cash. It's all artwork and real estate.
Well, that was my question,
Yeah.
so what do you think it's worth, and what kind of money did this guy make?
Well, he was making a couple $1 million a year at the end of his life, and more than that in earlier times. Michael Mckenzie guaranteed him $1 million a year just for the work he was doing. And generally speaking, Morgan Art was paying him, after all of the expenses and whatnot, a little bit over $1 million a year. So he had plenty of money. And that was the source of everybody knows everybody's business.
We didn't even go into the circle of the studio assistants that surrounded him that were being paid, tens of thousands of dollars a week, some of them.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Is there any indication that the medication that he was taking for end-of-life medication was legally prescribed?
Well, it was legal in the sense that his nurse was administering end-of-life care, and she's licensed to do so. So she was legally doing so under her authority. Now the question is, and I'm not disputing this at all, but there is a legitimate question whether he knew that. I don't know the answer to that. I know that based on what I've heard, that he was involved in planning his end-of-life care, at least in terms of staffing. He was insistent on having it be Islanders and people he knew. He was a very private person, didn't like people in his house that he didn't know. And that became an issue toward the end. Again, he was isolated, but he sort of chose that too by limiting the number of people he wanted in and out of his home. And so some of those questions we don't know the answer to.
And being a Christian Science participant, he was allowing medication with us.
Yeah, his friends dispute whether he would have allowed that or not, but we really don't know the answer to that. I can't speculate. Yeah.
I have a question for both of you. Josh, what number pandemic reading is this for you? Was it one of them?
Wait,
Because you keep posting like pandemic number, whatever.
oh, well, I get to be the earliest part of it. Jeez, yeah. I mean, other than Bob, I've read this book more than anyone else, which was my promise to him.
Yeah.
No one else will read these sentences more times than I will.
Yeah. I think actually Josh knows the guts of this book in some ways better than I do.
I don't know. I don't think that,
Well,
but
do you have even more questions now, Bob?
Do I have more
Now
questions?
that you.
Oh, yeah.
Now that you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've talked about what do we want to do in terms of adding on to this book, or do we do an update and whatnot? Not just in the legal sense, but I'm convinced there are people such as Jamie Thomas who have not talked yet, at some point will. And when he does, I want to have that conversation. There have been some new legal developments since the book came out that are very interesting, involving Michael Mckenzie and Morgan Art Foundation. And depending on what my reporting, where that reporting goes with that, we might add some to the epilogue.
I'm gonna read a couple questions from the epilogue.
Yeah.
This book was, everyone's hearing about the supply chain in publishing right now. It is beyond real. You only know the tip of the iceberg. So publishing is, in terms of moving a book from a finished book to a hardcover in your hand, is very difficult right now. So we released files to the printer for this book basically June 1st. And Memorial Day weekend, after 2.5 days, my partner Tammy just let me know, you haven't left the apartment for a couple days, honey. Because there was breaking news and Bob and I were just, ping ponging emails and phone calls for 48 hours, updating the interior of the book. And part of that was the epilogue. So here are a couple legitimate questions in the epilogue that are not answered. And these are about Jamie Thomas, who was controlling his life at the end. Why did he, Jamie Thomas, withdraw $615,000 in cash from Indiana's accounts, often in denominations of $100 bills, over the course of 2 years? Why did Jamie Thomas's wife turn over a bag of cash with $179,000 in it after Indiana died? And who hid $95,000 in cash behind the filing cabinet? And these are some of the questions about the money at the end that are unanswered. That money behind the filing cabinet was because Bob got one of the art movers who came in after Indiana's death and was literally, packing stuff off to store it, moved a filing cabinet, and a folder of money fell out.
Yeah, you can't make it up.
You can't make it up. HBO is going to have a great time. I hope she sees.
Who's gonna play Robert Indiana in the film?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
I've got my picks. Well, I just think Kevin Spacey would be crazy because we're all prepared to dislike him.
Yeah, and I bet he would embrace that challenge.
But someone else had a good idea. I can't remember what it was now.
I had Bob Odenkirk playing Michael Mckenzie.
Oh, Mckenzie would be great. Yeah, from Better Call Saul. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
I've seen pictures apparently in the newspaper of people fixing it up. And
Yes.
rebuilding it and going over it at classes and art lessons or something.
At the Star of Hope, yes. The Star of Hope Foundation has invested a fair amount of money. I forget the figure, but $1 million or so, more than that, into the architectural integrity of the building. And they have replaced the front windows. So they're now windows that open up onto Main Street. I interviewed some people in the community of Vinyl Haven after that happened, and they said it was the first time they've been able to look inside that building since he put the shutters up there. There have been student art shows. The first art shows in that building were student art shows. And at that point, the building had not been physically open to the public, but they were on view so you could see them from Main Street through the windows. The work that they have done involves just the architectural and the surface level things. So the interior has not been rebuilt. The last time I was in the Star of Hope, which was this summer, it was mostly down to studs. And so they have a lot of rebuilding and refurbishing to do. And that work, I'm sure, has commenced at this point. So it'll be some time before it's fully functional, but it is functioning now as a community center.
I just know too much about the background. I'm gonna ask a question leading from that. Do you think the Star of Hope as a foundation is going to honor what Robert Indiana wanted, or because he was so divisive, it'll change,
Yeah, I think it will definitely change based on what he envisioned. Indiana envisioned the Star of Hope as a museum for himself, open to the public, and that will not be the case. The Star of Hope will have a public function as an educational center and a place for classes, as you noted, and that sort of thing. But the museum aspect won't exist. I'll be shocked if it exists out there. There has been some discussion among people who don't have authority that perhaps there might be an Indiana museum on the mainland, which would be more accessible, which would not create the tension with the Vinyl Haven community, and which could be designed to show art, which is the Star of Hope was not. The foundation, the Star of Hope Foundation, owns a lot of artwork, and they should find a way to display that. And it could be among main museums, or they could do their own.
Well,
Sorry.
one last question after this, because Mary Lou's, but just to put, so the Star of Hope Foundation, which came into existence to honor the man, is using his money to erase him from the island.
Yeah.
To, again, that whole story of how he was or wasn't accepted on Vinyl Haven is really powerful.
That
So you guys gotta flip a coin. One of you gets the last question.
Yeah. Well, and I'll answer anything later too.
Okay. And then Bob will sign books for people.
Yeah.
So I only know we really largely, I'll admit, many people do just from the love
Yeah.
and help. So where in the art world in general does he fall, or how much of his legacy is going to be about this incredible story of him, or where do you place him in the great artists of the 20th century?
Okay, well, I wouldn't put him at the top of the great artists of the 20th century, but he certainly is unique in that he took the idea of combining images and words and numbers and text to a level that others hadn't done. And he was able to do so in such a way to tell us the story of his life. His work appears somewhat perhaps superficial, but his work is full of meaning and full of layers and full of biography, frankly. And that will have a lasting impact. I think once the controversy over his death and the lawsuit subsides, which maybe takes a decade or more, I think the legitimate work that he made, which I think will be very easy to distinguish, will have gained value, because he was unique. He was not a pop artist. He didn't want to see himself as a pop artist. He was a 20th century painter that did all kinds of, and sculpturist who did all kinds of different work, and he didn't like being labeled as a pop artist, and that made him bristle. So I do think he will succeed in having created a body of work that will outlast him and his reputation, and whatever, couple hundred years from now, people will be interpreting that work and talking about him as an artist. That's what I think.
All right, last one.
Where's he buried?
He's not. The ashes were spread. Oh, well, his ashes went to Jamie Thomas and the people around him. I have been told they were spread, but I don't know if there's a fact. Yeah. So the other thing, this is the part that just doesn't seem to make sense to me as an arts writer. Robert Indiana was the most famous artist living in Maine that I wrote about. There's never been any sort of public memorial for him in the state. There's been all we've done is learned about the lawsuit and his death and the art fraud. Nothing has been done to just talk about him and his work. And I do think it would help advance the story, so to speak, or get some closure if there was some sort of acknowledgement, either on the anniversary of his birth or the anniversary of his death or whatnot. And I do think that is a next logical step at some point down the road. I think that will help.
Thank you guys all so much. And I swear we have only talked about the tip of the iceberg of this story.
Thank you for being back in the room. It's been since March 2020, the last time we were here, so it's like tears of joy that we're back in this room together.
Wow.
And we've graduated from mugs, so we
Wow.
have caps for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here
Oh,
today. We
thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Bob's gonna stick around and sign some books if anybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
That's great. Yeah.